שלום, שמי אנטולי גולדברג. אני אשמח להתחיל את הסשן האחרון שלנו.
The final session for today. And our lecturer today, Professor Moshe Zuckerman, is a professor emeritus from the Tel Aviv University. He taught in the Institute of History and Philosophy of the Sciences and Ideas. And his areas of research are the history and philosophy of the humanities, society and culture, Frankfurt School, aesthetic theory, and the sociology of art, and the impact of the Holocaust on the various cultures of Israel and Germany. Please. And his lecture is titled "The Promethean Figure at the Dawn of the Modern Era." Humboldt. Hello, everybody. I saw that some of the previous presenters opened by saying that they don't know or didn't know who Humboldt was, but they still want to talk about Humboldt. And I have to actually join in. I mean, I know exactly who Humboldt is, but I actually know Alec Humboldt's brother, Willem von Humboldt. And it's actually, he's maybe more well known for his writings. I also read Alexander von Humboldt, but I'm not, again, a scientist. I don't come from the sciences. My field is the humanities. And yet I decided to talk about Alexander von Humboldt, as was previously said, and as you can see from the title of my presentation, as the figure that I wish to place in the context of its period of time in order to characterize it as a figure, but also to characterize something about the intellectual, about that German scientist in that period of time. And in order to do this, I have to talk about that period of time. And I can also maybe talk about that period of the Enlightenment and ask the question about that point in time. But first and foremost, let's talk about Germany around 1800. And Professor Matti Meisel actually talked about that, you know, the sacred Roman Empire, again, of the German people. And around 1800, it is no longer relevant to anything, despite the fact that from the medieval period until and henceforth, Germany actually ruled from Denmark to Sicily. Really rules over many parts of Europe, and in 1800, Germany is pretty, you know, backward, made up of some, you know, principalities, free cities, ruled by different dukes and such. And the person who actually turns it into sort of a mensch, so to speak, you know, using our language, is actually Napoleon. After he conquered Germany, turned those 360 units or principalities, or call them what you will, and those that couldn't be conducted or ruled in any manner, to 37 Prussian states in the east. Later, it will turn and evolve into Germany that turned into, again, that very, you know, Bismarck turned it into the Germany of the 19th century, that nobleman of Germany who actually unified it from the top, in contrast to the unity of France from bottom up. It wasn't, again, really, there wasn't any real social German revolution coming from the people, but there was a unity of the authorities. So when we talk about authoritism, it's a type of authority of that German political system in the 19th century, with all its results and repercussions, you know, catastrophical, if I may say, in the 19th century. The Führerprinzip, that principle of the Führer, was actually something that we know from, you know, German politics in the 19th century. So if you talk about what is Germany of that time, of Humboldt's time, and as, let me add right away, as my predecessor said, you know, he wanted to talk about Humboldt and Goethe, but talked a little bit about Goethe. I will, you know, expand a little bit on Goethe, and I will also maybe sort of connect the two, because as we heard, Alexander von Humboldt, or the two Humboldt brothers, and Goethe, again, were very friendly. They actually had a very deep friendship. And Wilhelm von Humboldt was also a close friend of Schiller. So if you take that, you know, that sort of Goethe, Schiller, and those two Humboldt brothers, that's, you know, sort of a this quartet, you'll get the spirit, the German spirit of the time. So we talk about the glorification of the German spirit of the time. You have to understand the sociological context as well, because von Humboldt, you know, those two von Humboldt brothers actually signifies the fact that they come from nobility. Von Goethe, Wolfgang von Goethe, was also of noble origin. Schiller, by the way, did not. But the important point here is that this nobility, as it appears, manifest in this characters of Humboldt and Goethe, actually deviates from the Prussians and Junkers and the rest of them, because it's in a very educated nobility. Not only that, it actually gives the tone for the entire German culture in 19th century. Humboldt, the brother, till this day, I would say, is the sample or the model for Bildung, okay, which is the education, German education, and his theory or his doctrine for education and erudition actually becomes the basis for German education and culture till this date. And Alexander von Humboldt was a model of that German scientist, and I will place him in context as well when I talk about the philosophy of ideas, that German scientist who indeed received, again, that title because of something that deviates from the regular nobility, because they're great Prussian, Junker nobility, and you can maybe say this about the Russian nobility as well. I'm not saying all of them, but most of them were, you know, were illiterate. Definitely most of them were not very educated, right? We talked about, the music and Mussorgsky. Remember that first scene that the prince, Takeruti, wants to write something for the Tsar, and he needs somebody who actually knows how to write because he doesn't know how to. I think this was basically the situation of many of the nobility, not so in France, by the way, and the difference between Germany and France as far as this was concerned, and something that was written much about. Many researchers wrote about this and made that comparison between Germany and France. Inter alia Hans Komm, who was part of the Brit Shalom here in Israel. And they basically came and said the difference between France of the 18th century and Germany of the 18th and 19th century was that as a result of the deterioration of the French nobility throughout the 18th century, and the fact that it became stagnant, more and more, again, from the bourgeois started, again, taking on those jobs and the different titles. They started buying the titles of the nobility. And one of the reasons why the French revolutionists, that, again, they were between 25 and 35 years old when the revolution broke out, again, 1889, French Revolution. Why? 1789. Yes, I'm glad you didn't fall asleep. Thanks for that correction. Yes. 1789, the big French Revolution. There were actually four. In 1830, and then later on, 1871, right, the Commune Parisi. But the important point here is that when they, again, that revolution, the revolution that, again, was considered to be the most awesome, or the fact that it was exactly like the exemplary revolution and was actually able to do what it wanted to, was it because they came prepared to this revolution? They came prepared in terms of their jobs, their administration, and what is important, and this has to do with Mati's presentation, because they were already inside the French army. They were officers, even senior officers, so they were ready. I'm saying the generals, again, came to that revolution ready, and as far as I'm concerned, they came with a readiness a civil readiness, so to speak, to actually take on these new roles and jobs. In Germany, on the other hand, and the sociologist Neumann Elias, who was a German Jew, in Germany, on the other hand, the boundaries between the different echelons, okay, we're not even talking about the status, the different echelons existing in the 18th century were so hermetic, they were so sealed that it wasn't even fathomable to actually think that somebody from the bourgeois or the middle class would actually go up to higher ranks. And it just was not possible in Germany. It was hermetically sealed. What did happen in Germany, and I'm slowly, getting to the main topic, which is Humboldt and Goethe, there is this layer that forms of these philosophers, intellectuals, that come from the middle class, the bourgeois, and then since that middle class has no say, really, or has no possibility to impact German politics, and as I said, Germany at the time, okay, is that sort of like a dead body, so to speak. It was stagnant. The issue of culture, philosophy, and science become, I would say that specific, that small layer of people, again, is really an expert on, because Germany talks about Kulturaktion, meaning it cannot see itself at that point in time as a united nation. This would happen many years later, after, again, everything would converge into those different crises that transpired. But it's meaning, what does it boast about? And what is it good at? That thing that I talked of, because that, we're talking about Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, all the way till, the Viennese of the 20th century. Again, that's philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so forth. That's the layer. That's the echelon. That's a foundation. That's the strong layer. And that's what, again, that's where this topic or this issue of becoming philosophers, becoming intellectual, this connects very nicely to the fact that Germany is so divided. One of the reasons that until this, today, there are so many theaters in Germany, so many museums in Germany, so many choirs, so many different sort of academies of sciences. Maybe it's connected to the fact that every principality, every dukedom, every little state created for itself its institutions. When Germany unites, there are so many such cultural institutions. Because of that previous division, they don't always, stay intact or survive. But it was completely clear that there is that cultural climate that existed of, again, a culture which is that Germany is so proud of in the 19th century, and that slogan Besitz und Bildung, meaning we sort of property and education, that becomes that slogan. It is us. We have to manage the state. So the management of the state, politically speaking, is conducted in such a way that the political management or conduct was so infantile, was so unsuccessful, was so ineffective in terms of the politics of it, that at the end of the day, the unity of Germany was done again, in authoritarian fashion from the top, imposed from the top, from the authorities. And we have that sense again, when the minute it was united from the top, from the upper layers, they started asking the question, and what about us? What about us, the colonies? And as we heard, France had colonies. Britain had colonies at the time. There were Spanish colonies in Portugal, and so did the Dutch have. What about Germany? So in Germany, and they didn't have too much, because that's one of the basic claims that I have, was that since there wasn't really developed very, sophisticated colonialism in Germany in the 18th century and the 19th century. And again, it wasn't possible because it was very divided and not united. So in the 20th century, we were actually hit by the German imperialism. Matti spoke about this before. Let me refer again back to 1800. So if you look at the German map, a European map rather, and you see that block of France in one color, and you'd see England again in a different color, and the whole block of all those blues on top, the Scandinavian states, and maybe what starts on the right-hand side of the map and never, would never end, the, huge British Empire that expands and expands. And in the middle, you actually see like a Persian carpet in the middle, all these dots. And those are the 360 principalities that I mentioned. And as I said earlier, this actually lies in counter to the perception of what should be. You know what Marx said, the Germans actually thought what other countries realized is actually part of the tragedy, the German tragedy, but not only part of the tragedy of those who at the end of the day had to suffer the fact that the Germans turned into what they turned into. And that is, again, a very important point. But now going to modern times. And modern times, what do I mean? As, again, my friend said before, again, very generally speaking, I'm generalizing. So for me, it begins in the last third again of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution that changes the economy of the West. And when I say West, again, it will have an impact on the entire world. And again, the economy, the new type of production and industry as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And the new line of production actually brings forth a new type of society. It's a society that is ruled by that middle class. The bourgeois, they are sort of even more considered like the nobility. I mean, no more nobility, no dukes. People sort of become citizens independently. And the other political perspective is that French Revolution that I mentioned before, which actually determines that double principle of, again, the modern nation state, which is territory and population as a collective, as a nation that again populates a territory, and some sort of a common denominator in terms of culture or language. Again, those three conditions, by the way, did not exist in Zionism. If you recall our history, remember the conditions in which Zionism turned into the engine of our national solution for the Jewish people as a result of anti-Semitic trends in the 19th century in Europe. The third element, and I'm going to, now I'm diving a little more deeply, the third element is the Enlightenment movement. Let me talk about this, because you can't talk about Humboldt number one and Humboldt number two, the brother. You can't talk about Goethe without the Enlightenment. And in this specific respect, I just want to maybe dwell on the Enlightenment and say as follows, because the Enlightenment had, of course, had its beginnings. I don't even, I would say in the 19th century, especially again in France, but not only Scotland and in Britain. Again, there were sort of schools of the Enlightenment movement. And I would say that the determining factor of the Enlightenment was that a person becomes the core of existence, the center of the existence. It means that the world perception, according to which, again, man is some sort of a worm that's just put there, because of divine providence, is able to exist. The Enlightenment comes and say, no, the human being can be a subject. It can becomes he is an entity. He is a sovereign entity. And the famous definition of Immanuel Kant to the Enlightenment, again, it's the man's emerging from his, again, lack of independence, that it was his fault. He says that, a person, you have to dare and think for yourself in order to become your own sovereign. You're a subject, you're an individual, an entity who's able to think, to determine what he's going to do, who thinks of himself as a worthy entity. Now, this cannot be taken for granted, because this also, again, had to do with all those revolutions that took place. Only if you topple down those elites, again, of royalty and the church, you can actually turn man into somebody who can be a sovereign being. What does this mean? This means two other things, and I would like to mention these in this context. Number one, a person, the human being, the fact that he's an educated person, he has knowledge and a mind, he can determine his steps, he can also control his future. He can, he's a master of his fate, not only on the individual level, but also on the collective level, according to the Enlightenment. What does this mean? That from the point in time that I have that collective, nation, society, call it what you will, it is also able to determine for itself what its objectives are, what its aims are, what its goals are. Not only can it set its goals, the future goals, it can also realize these goals, fulfill these dreams. Sorry, we cannot hear the question from the audience. Descartes, I don't know about, yes, he said again, I exist, therefore I am. That's 50 years earlier. Okay. I'm talking about Immanuel Kant. He was, by the way, a great admirer of Descartes, but he also, says something else completely. I'm not going to go into Descartes now, but I do want to talk about the fact that the very fact that there is this perception that says that not only that a person can be his own sovereign being, but even it can be a collective sovereign and create his own history as a collective. This turns human beings into entities that can, create again and become even the master of the world, become the master of the nation, can become the master of his own social fate. Now you have to understand this great revolution of the Enlightenment as far as this is concerned. It actually collapsed at some point, but the great revolution was we are no longer dependent. Before the atheism came and secularization came, it was part of secularization, but not only. But the very fact that people came and said, a person is worthy to determine his own fate. I mean, this cannot be taken for granted because there is God, after all. And if you cast a doubt about, when it comes to God, then, what might be? You'll be, burnt at the stake. You can't turn against church and God. But the Enlightenment, in this sense, came and said, I don't want to say anything about faith. You want to be faithful. You want to believe in God. That's fine in your own home. But in terms of culture and society, man is, again, a master of his own fate. This approach, this perception, again, which, at the end, they said that you can put God aside, and suddenly you actually discover that even in middle class, there is that top and bottom doesn't always work. But again, during that period in time, that was the ideology. And this great ideology actually brings forth philosophers and intellectuals, and we use, von Humboldt and the other von Humboldt, but these two Humboldt and Goethe, they come into the picture. What do I mean? They are figures that you may call, from the Renaissance. They are sort of Renaissance figures in a way, because they were educated not only in one area, one field, but they are competent. They have abilities in all sorts of fields. Like Leonardo da Vinci was not only an artist, he was an engineer, and he was a designer, and he was a scientist, and he knew how to do all sorts of things in music and other fields, meaning he sort of had control and had education in all sorts of things. So that motto of the Bildung, as far as the Humboldt brothers were concerned, what did they say? We want to be Renaissance figures. That was the vision. Let's see how Goethe, whom for 40 years, again, and he's also a Renaissance sort of figure, how did he view Alexander von Humboldt? I imagine that I translated from Goethe's German, and he wrote it in one of his letters. So, who is this man? He talks about Alexander von Humboldt. What kind of a person is? I've known him for so long, and yet I'm still impressed by him every time. And you might even say that nobody actually can obtain his level and the vastness of his ideas and thought, except for Goethe himself, let me say in parentheses, right? And so many skills and talents he has. I've never come across such a thing. I'm quoting, right? He's always there, and he feels comfortable in every field, and he always can impact us spiritually. He's like a well with so many pipelines, and you have to just, place vessels there in order to catch that flow of water. That is how Goethe wrote about von Humboldt. Wow, to get such a, compliment from Goethe, I guess Alexander von Humboldt, was not only impressive in his time, but, even the great men of his time were very much impressed by him. Both of them were not just impressed by each other, but again, they had a relationship. And as I said, I don't come from the natural sciences, so whatever I may say to you, in terms of nature or science, it's just, I have minimum knowledge in this field. But again, the connection between them, again, was manifest in different areas, different fields. We heard about some of them. In some of them, we may have heard if we had this convention for 3 days. But one of the deeper connections was in the field of geology. Now, at that time, it wasn't called geology. But why don't you just... that's why I wanted us to, to leave the slide. I think it's wonderful, the slide that's up there. First of all, it's wonderful in the sense as to what it says from a point in time to sort of domineer the world and to turn the whole world into this quantitative entity, an entity that can be measured, that can be calculated. And that's why this illustration is wonderful, because it shows us the mountain as it appears in its most natural beauty, but underneath it, you see that whole issue that each one of these beautiful things are also subject to a formulation and to numbers and to quantities. I want you to remember this, please, because at the end of my presentation, when did I start? How much time do I have? Okay, I started at 4:05, so I have some time. So you see the beauty of nature on the one hand, and underneath, okay, I want to again translate that beauty of nature into formulations, into numbers. We heard about these things before. Like I could say about bees, all sorts of things, right? They're wonderful creatures, but not only, they're also creatures that, again, they manage a whole network of food and so forth. Another thing that's interesting, and that's part of geology, and that's maybe I would say, first of all, there was collaboration. Then there was a dispute between Alexander von Humboldt and Goethe. And this is what you see before you on the screen. There was this perception. And Abram Gottlob Werner, he was one of the forefathers of this perception. And he was the sort of the father of German geology. It wasn't called geology at the time. And his claim was that everything that we see in terms of the layers of the soil actually comes from the water, meaning that the water receded, then everything that we have in terms of geological layers are as residues or sediments or what was left of what once was underwater. It was called back then Neptunism, lovely name, Neptune, right, the god of the sea. And Goethe also called it Poseidonism, meaning he sort of subjected it to the god of the sea, of the Greek god of the sea. So this claim was indeed a claim that both Goethe and Alexander von Humboldt, they actually held on to this belief for quite some time, meaning part of their friendship, also their intellectual friendship, was a function of this common interest in this field. By the way, that Abram Gottlob Werner also, we heard about the mines, right? Mati talked about the mines. Was it you? Who was it that somebody mentioned the mines? I think he was the sort of the father of the whole doctrine of the mines, theory of the mines. Everybody came to study from him, and he was the man. And we also heard this about before, I think during Mati's talk as well. The observations. He taught us to observe things. Before you start calculating, observe. You have to observe, make very distinct observation. No, those descriptions that you mentioned, Mati, those things that are sort of the base of the foundations of our science today. So you may ask, how do we understand different layers of granite, for granite rock? How do you know it's, this rock, and it can't be something from the different types of layers? So they had some sort of explanation how, as a result of certain processes that had to do with the recession of the water, turned into granite. What they didn't have in their part of their awareness, at least not in the beginning stages, also Werner didn't, was what somebody by the name of Leopold von Buch, also he's a von, he's again the volcanism. He was the father of volcanism, meaning the claim that many of the things that we see and that we observe, and we heard about the Great Voyage to Russia, right? It was also a great voyage. Maybe it was even there was a more important voyage even to South America, and he had to go to all sorts of places and they had to be explained. So the explanations that he gives, and again, he made very detailed records of everything, as we were told. So those explanations, one day they actually collapse when they found out that the Alps, in all sorts of, again, mountains above 5,000 or 7,000 meters. I don't know if they knew they were familiar with the Himalayas back then, but suddenly they understand that it was all a function of tectonic processes and have to do with volcanism, volcanic processing. Meaning we have to understand what explaining what was in the core of the earth wasn't about lava, but all about hot layers, but they were not sort of very, boiling layers of volcanism. So Leopold von Buch and his discoveries brings about a crisis between von Humboldt and Goethe. Because Alexander von Humboldt, as a real scientist, he adopts the new insight of von Buch, and he writes about it, and again, without sort of making Goethe too upset, but Goethe gets really upset, wasn't willing to accept this at all, and he says, I don't understand my friend who suddenly deviates to all sorts of things. I mean, what is volcanism? Has anybody ever seen it? What is this tectonic processes? You see a layer, and that's it. We know what it's made of, but to say that something under the surface of the earth, inside the core of the earth, something happens, oh, come on. So Goethe really, couldn't deal with it. So I'm so glad that Alex von Humboldt, was able to accept it. And, they were both very good friends. They were both members of the Academy of Sciences in Berlin during that time. But a more scientific scientist, so to speak, I'm saying they were both very curious, okay? Goethe was also curious about botany and optics, and he has a whole theory of colors, very sophisticated. But in terms of knowledge, I would say that the scientific era, so to speak, that Humboldt had, and of course he was also limited at the time, but that scientific eros, I mean, Humboldt had it more sort of as a, I would say that Gesinn, that intentionality that Goethe had, and he supported that what you see is what you get. That was Goethe, through observation, that is how you study. But again, through observation, you can see what, you observe what you observe, but you can't observe what you cannot see. Meaning it can't actually connect to that calculation that von Buch started understanding at the time. So, of course, the scientist is limited. Now, it sounds as if I'm like, great expert on these things. I'm so not. I just know that this dispute between Goethe and between von Humboldt, I know from the principles of the philosophy of science. And again, and I was a member of this institution for so long, so of course I know something about the philosophy of the natural sciences. But the important point here is that this perception or this approach that says that we have that wisdom, and that's why, myth became some sort of, again, politicized religion, and then turned into monotheism, and this became into theology, and then this turned into philosophy, and this turned into the sciences, this whole change of civilization. At the end of the days, leads to the fact that faith in science, at least as far as, became a fetish, at least during that period of time. Now, why Prometheus? Okay, I mentioned the figure Prometheus because, Prometheus is one of the most beloved people, again, figures during the time of the Enlightenment because he was a man lover. So, again, if man is in the center, Prometheus is the man lover, right? He loved man. And then he starts, again, he got in a bind with the gods. And then there was a whole thing with Zeus and the vision of, again, the flesh of the offering. And that's why he got that terrible punishment. And he was bound up in chains to this big rock, if you recall. And every week, that eagle or that vulture, whatever it was, had to come and would sort of bite his liver. or maybe his great calamity was that there's that regeneration of the liver time and time again, so that he can keep living and the vulture keeps coming until, the god lets him go. But the important point here is that after some time, with time, Prometheus turned into a character or a figure that wasn't just a beloved figure, because of course he was the man lover. He also stole from Helios, from the god. He stole fire and brought the fire to men, to people. But also there's a myth that he even created human beings from clay, and he's almost like a god, right? So the other perception or different interpretation, or later interpretation of Prometheus was that he's, he's a trickster, he's witty, you can, blame him with forgery, with breach of trust and all things like that, and that he wasn't really a very reliable figure, wasn't trustworthy, and fact is he fights with the gods, and that's why he was punished. So this, again, polarity, again, having this dichotomy with regards to Prometheus, character, turning our modern times, and I'm going to dwell on this point, if I may, the dialectic sort of issues of the modern world, and, in contradiction to that era, the German Jewish philosopher Max Hogarth and Tordona actually wrote a very famous book called The Dialectics of the Enlightenment. And in this book, in this Dialectic of the Enlightenment, and again, do you know what I mean by dialectics? Yes, you people from the natural sciences, are you familiar with this term of the dialectics, right? So Hegel's approach, the dialectics says as follows: everything has, it's the other side. I mean, it can be sort of negative. So if I say P, so the non-P, according to, conventional logistics, one cannot, sort of, they can't coexist, right? One annuls the other. Hegel says, no, it's not this or that. Both can coexist, because the fact that within the non-P, I have P. Fact is, I call it non-P. So the P still exists. Non-P comes from the P itself. And if so, what can I say about the fact that it's not this or that? Maybe it's this and this. Then he says as follows. This is what Hegel says in his dialectics. Now let's turn P and the non-P into A and B, okay? A and B. Okay, let's say A and B are sort of, contradict each other or annul each other. So then there could be another C, which actually includes A and B, or parts of A and part of B. So Aufhoben, can't again translate this into Hebrew. This is a German term, has three different meanings. Okay, and this is from the daily life. It's not from philosophy. It's to negate something. B negates A. It's also preservation or conservation. I preserve both. And it's also, elevating it to a higher level. Okay, it was also it's a translation from the German as well, meaning it doesn't solve the problem, but again, it doesn't solve the problem that things can conserve or preserve something else, but annul it at the same time. Who talked about it? The Jerusalemite philosopher. Oh, I'm from Tel Aviv, so I always forget. Okay, Yirmiyahu Yovel. Okay, Yirmiyahu Yovel talked about this. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, but the Aufhebung, which is that German word that I mentioned, it basically says, I can annul something. I can preserve it at the same time, which is exactly the opposite of annulling, but I can elevate it to a different level. And again, this is part of the Aufhebung, which is part of the German language. And Hegel says, look how the language teaches us philosophy. So if A and B create C, and C creates a new contradiction, which is D, and that creates another synthesis, okay, or a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the second thesis says as follows, that if C and D are with E, and A and B are inside C, then E actually comprises everything. Meaning, if you think of the question, how was this created, this thing that I'm holding, according to Hegel's approach, you have to think about all the different technologies, of thousands of years, created this. as far as watch Kubrick, by the way. You remember the prologue, or Star Trek, or whatever it was again that sort of human sort of apey figure that uses something to break things, but also as a tool, a labor tool. How it brought, again, it led him to such joy that he threw it into space, and then we see this object sort of slowly metamorphosing into a rocket, meaning that spaceship has the same entities, of same properties. So again, I have 5 more minutes actually, right? Is that what I do? I understand. You didn't give me the signal, sir. Okay. Okay, so it says this. So this, what does all this mean? Since time immemorial, that primeval man was afraid. The primeval man was afraid of nature. Now, why? Because of famine and lightning and flooding, and to even understand, they didn't even have the means to explain these phenomena. They didn't even have the gods to explain this. You are always anxious. You live in fear of nature. Now, they claim that already in prehistoric times, that again, that primeval man, created mechanisms to do away with that fear. In order to do away with that fear, get rid of that fear of nature, man started creating mechanisms. Like what? And again, this is interesting. The minute that, again, when I look up and down, looks to the right, looks to the left, if I would look, say, west and east, if I say north and south, the minute I use these terms, the minute I know how to categorize and say, this is a tree, and this is a bush, and this is a rock, I start again having control over nature, not only physically but also mentally speaking. So that control over nature as a result of these processes of science, on the one hand, it means that we have the possibility to understand the world, to get to know the world within this mechanism that humans need. But they've already claimed something else. Again, controlling that external nature also resulted in controlling the inner nature, meaning man's nature, because we are part of nature. We come from the apes. Meaning controlling external nature means that we can control our own nature. And that means that, and then we move to man's, again, controlling other people. So the Bible taught us already, you eat from the tree of knowledge, it will end with catastrophe. Not only catastrophe, but the minute you'll be evacuated from Eden, kicked out of Eden, the first story in the Bible, what happens? First of all, there is again dispute between brothers, and the first murder takes place. That means that knowledge, on the one hand, is something we cannot become that collective entity that has control. But knowledge can turn into a mechanism through which you can control other people in a repressive manner. And then what do? That, again, gas, you can use gas to make an omelet or cook, but gas can actually turn into a means through which you destroy people. So in order to, again, destroy people and demolish people on an industrial level, yes, Hitler sends out his scientists so that they will prepare this gas for him. Because the different techniques just weren't effective enough to destroy people, like masses of people. And this is how this comes full circle. We said that enlightenment, the human becomes an individual with the self-consciousness. And same again, generation of Auschwitz, in Auschwitz, not that the individual died. The exemplar died. The exemplary model died, meaning something that was subject to some sort of abstraction. And as a result of this abstraction actually, enabled us to treat humans as an object, not only as a person. Now, this relates to this particular period in time that we're talking about. Getting to know the world, trekking through Russia to describe, the world, voyaging to South America to see what's happening there. And this was created by, again, a person described by Goethe as a Renaissance figure, when Goethe himself was a Renaissance figure. That is the same point in time that creates that dialectic of the modern dialectics of science, of knowledge, and maybe through this dialectic of knowledge and of the sciences, maybe the dialectics of the destruction of humanity took place as well. But that is a whole different lecture. Thank you so much. I would like to thank So there were a few processes that took place, you know, when I studied, you know, I got to know Humboldt years ago, you know, became aware of Humboldt many years ago, but I even learned today, I learned a lot, and there's so much to learn about. You can't even, you know, learn half of what there is to learn. But when I read the abstract of Professor Zuckerman's lecture today, I just want to share with you, and please, I want to encourage you to keep thinking. You know, he used the term Renaissance figure, and he actually, in his title, he said a Promethean sort of figure. So first of all, indeed, Goethe was, and again, he was a man of many fields, many hats, but von Humboldt, again, was an expert in many more fields. So many people think that Faust, in the famous play, right, by Goethe, it's the same figure that was created as a result of Humboldt. Humboldt was a model for Faust. Now Faust sells his soul to the Satan in order to gain more knowledge, in order to impact the world with his knowledge, and then at the end pays a price, a very heavy price for that. And Goethe relates to Faust. You know, he and accept what he does. You know, he not too harshly. And why does, you know, Humboldt? Why does he serve as a model for Faust, for Goethe when he writes Faust? Humboldt, right, gains a lot of knowledge. Was he punished? Maybe, yes. Maybe the fact, again, Promethean, the fact that the liver, again, was bitten, was that, again, sort of a decree. That was maybe humanity's punishment imposed on Humboldt. And I had a few similar ideas. So, again, the title of your presentation, can I just add one sentence, please? Again, Faust, let me just add a word. It was just said, Faust, you know, it's not that he sort of forgave him, but again, Faust, again, was sort of a criminal. He impregnates a woman, then he leaves in the second part of the play, if you remember, again, based on Greek mythology. But in order to sort of dry a sea, in order to gain more and more territory, he also causes the death of the elderly people, if you recall. So in Goethe's period of time, again, why are you being so forgiving? Why do you let him, you know, enter Eden at the end of it all? And the answer was, maybe this is compatible with what you just said, is because he aspired, because he tried, because he wanted to, again, obtain that greatness. And that's the big sort of ideal that Goethe sees. So I would like, again, to give you this little token of appreciation. Thank you so much.